I'm Kat Neville, and I've been telling the story of local food for about 20 years. In that time, I've seen the American food movement explode in tiny towns and big cities from coast to coast. In Tastemakers, I explore the maker movement and take you along for the journey to meet the makers who define the flavor of American cuisine. The craft beer industry is constantly changing, and one of the main ingredients in beer, yeast, is now being seen as a way to do more than just produce alcohol. So today we are here at Omega Yeast to check in with this innovative company that is working directly in tandem with the beer industry.
I attended the University of Illinois as an undergrad in microbiology, and then went from there to graduate school and got my PhD in microbiology and molecular genetics, and there I did actually study yeast. It did get me, a lot of hands-on with yeast and got me comfortable storing yeast. I started my collection of yeast at that point, and then took a detour. I went to law school, becoming a patent lawyer. At the law firm that I was at, I had a chance discussion with one of my former colleagues, Andy Smith, one of the co-founders of 1090 Brewing. We were at our annual associates lunch that the firm put on every year, and he was just talking about the trials they were going through and founding their brewery. And he just mentioned where they were going to be getting their yeast and how expensive it would be to ship it overnight. That single conversation sparked an idea that a yeast lab was needed in the Midwest. There's nobody else doing this in the Midwest, and the growth of the industry suggested that there'd be support for it. There are enough breweries in Chicago that we could start with a very local focus, and so it is one of those things where it literally happened because of that conversation. Mark and I, we were both attorneys at the same firm. So after I had the fateful conversation with Andy, it was, I think, probably the next day, I reached out to Mark. I always knew that he had an entrepreneurial spirit about him, where I was really just a scientist. It was not even a day or two later that he came to my office and was like, "Do you want a business partner?" And I didn't hesitate.
We founded the company back in 2013. Lance being a PhD in microbiology, and me with my engineering background, Omega Yeast was born. I think we complement each other very well.
He kind of handles the business and the marketing side of things, and I make sure that the production facility, runs and that we have what we need here.
So you have to explain to me what's going on. I mean, I'm assuming that this is where all the yeast is growing?
Yep, this is where the process starts. The funny thing is, this is basically how a home brewer would grow yeast at home at the beginning. But we start with completely sterile media and inoculate a small flask with a small amount of yeast and let it grow for 24 hours, step that up, split out into other cultures, let that grow. So it's just a process of continuing to feed, and then the yeast continues to grow and multiply.
And it takes like roughly 4 or 5 days to get to like that maturity point where it's ready to be packaged?
There's other species of yeast used in brewing that can take longer than that, but for a typical brewing strain, it's 5 or 6 days turnaround. So yeast is a single-celled organism, a microbe. So if you want to see a single yeast cell, you have to look into a microscope to be able to actually see it. The ale yeast that people use to make beer and to make bread is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And I think one of the interesting things about it that maybe a layman wouldn't know is that it is a eukaryote. Humans are eukaryotes. So we're, somewhat related to yeast. And you can take a human version of a cell and put it in a yeast cell, and it'll perform the same functions. So yeast are actually more closely related to humans than they are to bacteria, even though they're both single-celled organisms. They are everywhere in nature. I mean, it's hard not to find yeast. It's a little harder to find yeast that are good at making beer. They've become domesticated by human activity over the centuries. So there are certain hallmarks of domestication in these strains that are reflective of the use that humans have put them to for all these years, unknowingly. And it's just a matter of kind of selection over the centuries for traits that people liked. If they had a culture that was producing a beer they liked, they would keep that and keep reusing it, pass it to other brewers, and then might go down a different evolutionary chain with that brewer. And so it's just passing these things around, which has led to the vast array of flavors and characteristics we have today. To start out, we made sure we had all the well-known strains that we knew lots of brewers like to use, but we've also made it our mission to find new tools, new strains out there from various sources. We've got a large collection of strains from Norway. We have this connection with a Lithuanian brewer that gives us these unique strains and allows us to give more tools to brewers that are opening up, new styles and possibilities.
We really see ourselves as partners. So, logistics, that sort of thing, production, how can we help them in the yeast world? So for instance, we're getting well known for finding strains from all over the world that can do really unique and unusual things, and not only create wonderful tastes and things like that, but we have strains that can ferment faster so they can make more beer quickly. We have all kinds of strains that really help them do and execute all kinds of different things they're looking to do in their brewery. So the part of the business I especially love is being able to go in and really be partners and really say, hey, these 3 things we can help you do, and we can help you right now.
I kind of play it by ear when a brewery reaches out to us. Some of them know very much what strain they want to use. If I know it to be a reliable strain and that's what they want, that's what we'll make for them. And what they're going to get from us is a propagation for them.
As opposed to making large batches, 100 barrels of yeast, we essentially do it in a much more flexible, custom manner, meaning we don't even start making the yeast till the brewer orders it.
We start that propagation when they order it, and a week later send it to them. It is as fresh as it can possibly be.
So the yeast cells are kind of growing on a medium, like in these little petri dishes, essentially.
This plate contains agar, which is like a seaweed derivative that just gives you kind of a solid base, but within this is also dissolved a bunch of yeast nutrients. So when you scrape some yeast onto this plate, they'll grow up into these little colonies. So each time you see like a little dot on a plate, that is essentially a colony of yeast that arose from a single cell that was deposited on that spot.
So how many yeast cells would you estimate are in one of those dots?
Well over 1 million cells in one of those dots. One cell becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, and they can double, every hour and a half. So you're getting exponential growth.
Wow. So from here, do you kind of scrape all of that off and put it in one of these flasks?
Right, we do an aseptic transfer to make sure that we're only transferring the microbes we want. So yes, we'll use a sterile loop to scrape cells off of this plate and swizzle it into a flask, and that starts the whole process. You can use all sorts of different things to grow yeast, but it's almost like they have a memory, and so you want to grow them on what they're going to see, and they'll perform better for the brewer. Our entire process, we use wort. It's the medium that it's going to see when it gets to the brewer, so it performs best if we've grown it in that same medium.
All these little yeast cells are all excited. They're about to be consumed.
Yes, we're taking them from 1 million cells to trillions of cells in a matter of 5 or 6 days to send it off to the brewer.
It's amazing to really think about just the way that we've kind of culturally as human beings kind of captured these single-celled organisms to do all of these wonderful fermentation tasks for us.
And unwittingly, essentially. We didn't know what they were until the late 1800s, but we've been using yeast for, millennia.
What do you call this other area?
Wort production.
Wort production.
Yeah.
All right, let's go check out the wort production.
All right. The brewer's job in making beer is to essentially create a growth medium for yeast. So they're taking starches in malt and converting those into sugars that ultimately the yeast are going to be able to consume. So when you get to that stage, you've cooled down the wort and you add the yeast goes to work consuming the sugars, and they'll use that sugar as an energy source to make more yeast. The byproduct of that is alcohol and carbon dioxide. The brewer makes the wort, and the yeast makes the beer.
So when I first came in and we walked into this room, I thought all of these were standard brewing tanks, but they're not. This is where the yeast is really starting to multiply.
Right, this is where we get the big numbers. It's a giant version of what you saw in the lab. It's just a big tank, and instead of a little magnet inside, we've got a giant fan, pushing things around and scrubs the CO2 out that the yeast is producing, keeps them up and in contact with the nutrients so they'll grow faster and to a higher cell count.
How interesting. I'm starting to see a little bit of a theme with the names of your tanks. Why don't you tell us about that?
So we've got McGill and Goodman over here. We've got Loblaw, Matlock, Mason, and Hutz. So if you put it together, these are all fictional lawyers, just as kind of a nod to our background.
You couldn't leave the law behind.
We couldn't, so now I have to see it every day.
Kind of remind you of what you left.
Of my humble roots.
I love it. And so in here, that's just more of the wort that you've created.
Yeah, so we use the big boil kettles to produce, large volumes of wort that end up in these tanks to grow ever more yeast. When the yeast is done growing, the mixers get turned off and the yeast all just settles to the bottom. Then we can get rid of our beer. Whereas a brewery is wanting to keep the beer, we want to keep the yeast. So we get rid of our beer, which would be very oxidized and gross beer. It is drinkable, but it's not good.
Don't tell people you're throwing away beer.
Yeah, I mean, so then we drain all that beer out and then package the yeast and send it out to customers all over the country.
I love it. I bet when the brewers get their shipment of yeast, they're like, oh, yay.
Yeah, kid on Christmas.
Yeast is one of the 4 base ingredients in beer, and here at Old Irving, Trevor uses his background as a chef to inform which yeast he's using when he's building his beer recipes.
It's an interesting thing, making the shift from being a chef to a brewer. There's a lot of parallels. Basically, the thing I really loved about cooking was actually a lot of low and slow processes. I really did like the high intensity of the kitchen. I liked all those things, but I noticed myself getting a lot of enjoyment out of like making a mole, something that takes like 7 hours. It takes patience, and you go through and you taste until it's absolutely perfect until the end. I started home brewing around that same time. Me and my buddy would just home brew, and we're doing all grain brewing. I really loved it. I didn't ever want to not be doing it. I saw a huge gaping hole in the Chicago industry for brew pubs specifically, and that's kind of where the journey began. With yeast as an ingredient, it's just kind of like, I call it like another one of my crayons. I don't want to ever take away a color in my crayons. So I always think about what the yeast can add to achieve what I need from the beer. We're going to make excellence happen, and part of that excellence also has to do with using those ingredients that go along with that, and that's why I use Omega.
We worked with Trevor right from the beginning. He's brewing a lot of Northeast-style IPAs, hazies, as some people call them. So we've given him some guidance on what strains to use to get the characteristics he's looking for. He's also doing some big stouts that he's barrel aging as well. So, he uses different strains to get higher alcohol content in those types of beers that'll stand up to barrel aging.
Recently, we made this beer called Cinnamon Prost Crunch. So we actually made a white stout. We didn't use any roasted malts at all, and I wanted to be able to achieve some sweetness, so I needed something that wasn't gonna attenuate as far, which means I had to mash higher. So, this is when I usually call Lance. I give him a call, I'm like, all right, man, this is a crazy idea I have, what do you think? And then he'll point me in a direction. In this case, it was an Irish ale yeast, which you would use in most stouts anyway. You mash a little bit higher, you add some lactose, add some beautiful cinnamon, some like really nice AAA Tahitian vanilla bean, bam, Cinnamon Prost Crunch. It went over really, really well. And that's kind of what we do. We like to be very playful, and then the yeast is just a component that'll help finish the story for us.
So I'm standing here with Trevor, and we're in the brewing area of the brew pub, and it's so fun because it's all sectioned off by a chain link fence, and it says, "Please do not feed the brewers." I love that.
Yeah, one of our employees, Tim, made that up last minute. He actually ordered it and everything, and I've been mad ever since. People quit feeding me. I'm really upset about it. I've been losing weight like crazy. So,
I love it.
Yeah.
So we're gonna try the Rat Pack. Now remind
Correct.
me what this beer is.
So this is a quadruple ale, okay? So it's a Belgian ale, usually pretty malty, high in alcohol, so it's like 11.5%. It's been laid down in some Buffalo Trace Sazerac rye barrels for 8 months. About 2 months away from the end of the maturation phase, I added some tart cherries and some orange peel. So it's built exactly like an old-fashioned cocktail. So
Awesome.
yeah, let me give you a little bit. That ought to do it. And it kind of comes off, it's kind of almost like reductive as well, so you're gonna get some kind of like figgy, jammy notes
Yes,
to it.
absolutely.
And then this is the Omega Belgian Ale yeast strain that they use. And then
Wow. I've never had a beer like this.
no?
This tastes like a beer cocktail.
Yes, exactly.
It
yeah.
really does taste like an old fashioned, but in beer.
Yep. The whole point of this was because I love old fashions, and
So do I.
yeah, and it's, you know, especially this part of Illinois and so close to Wisconsin, people adore this cocktail. So I figured this is a good way straight to people's hearts.
This is delicious.
Thank
it may
you.
be 11 o'clock in the morning, but I think I might drink this.
Do it.
St. Louis's Perennial Artisan Ales is widely known for its unusual and experimental beers, but its ethos is firmly rooted in traditional yeast-forward styles.
We kind of take a different look upon the beer industry and kind of the way that we focus on our ingredients. We try to locally source as many things as we can, as well as kind of influencing a lot of culinary aspects into our beer. We want to try to pair things with specific dishes, maybe specific ideas behind the meal itself, as well as kind of just making a beer for an everyday beer drinker to enjoy. So we want to be adventurous, but at the same time still accessible. Here at Perennial, we definitely kind of focus mostly on the yeast, and I've done some experiments with making the same exact, base beer, the same grist, but just using 2 different yeasts, and it tastes vastly different. You can use the same yeast at different temperatures, and it tastes vastly different. It's such an organic, kind of wild part of the beer. We get a lot of our yeast from Omega. They are just absolutely amazing. It's really nice to be able to have such a really great working relationship with everybody there. And the yeast that they're giving us and they're producing, we've won some medals for at festivals and stuff like that. So it definitely has worked well for us on that front.
To be able to work with Perennial has been absolutely wonderful. Of all the breweries, I think in St. Louis, they were especially early adopters, and they, I think, recognized what we were doing from an early start, and we've been such close partners for so long now. It's just wonderful to have that relationship.
So now we're in the barrel room. It's kind of echoey. You can probably hear that. And I'm standing here with Chris, and we're going to taste some of these barrel-aged beers. And this is where they've had both primary and secondary fermentation. Is that right?
Correct. So this was completely fermented in this oak barrel. I pitched meaning put some yeast into there, some very basic Saccharomyces Belgian yeast that we got from Omega, kind of let that ferment out, and then after that pitched in some Brettanomyces as well as some resident cultures or some wild yeast, and we're going to sample some and see if it's ready to go.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there are a lot of oak kind of tannins coming off of it.
Absolutely. It's almost lemony.
Yeah, lemony, that's going to come from some of the Brettanomyces that we got from them, as well as some of the resident cultures. The grapefruit is still kind of there. It's kind of fermented out a little bit, but I can still get a little bit on the nose. I'd say that's pretty close to being ready.
That's delicious. This is the kind of beer that I really like because it's got that tartness, that sourness. It has a lot of just character to it.
Yeah.
I love it. And what's the name of this one?
It's called Reverse Faults.
Where do you guys come up with these names?
I originally went to school for geology and kind of science and stuff like that, so a reverse fault is a form of tectonic plate shifts, and I thought that would have been a cool beer name for this.
Well, it is a cool beer name. And a cool beer.
Glad you like it.
Cheers. Next up, we're going to check in with Ben here at Burnt City Brewing. When he is brewing a hoppy IPA, he's looking for a yeast that is going to leave a little bit of sweetness. But when he's brewing a farmhouse ale, he wants one that is going to chew through all of the sugars. So I'm standing here with Ben, and we're in the middle of this massive warehouse. It's pretty incredible. Tell me about just your general approach to beer. Like if I'm gonna pick up a Burnt City beer, I'm gonna go to your brew pub, what am I gonna have?
Lately we've been delving into a lot of farmhouse style ales, along with sort of more trendy, sort of fruity IPAs, and we also have a big soft spot for traditional German lagers and more
These are
traditional
very
English beers.
divergent.
We have trouble focusing on a specific area because we love variety.
Just kind of playing around and experimenting.
Yes.
We've worked with Ben at Burnt City really since the founding of Omega Yeast. He uses one of our kind of unique strains in his farmhouse beer that they call Balloon Boy. It's a hybrid strain and it gives him the flavor profile he's looking for with more reliable performance.
These wine barrels are full of your Balloon Boy. It's a Saison style, right?
It is. It's a wheat saison, essentially.
And what you've done there is you have augmented the beer with fruit, but then you're going to be adding in some other components as well. So kind of tell me about that.
Sure. So we have a combination of Cabernet and Chardonnay barrels over there. They're all filled with Balloon Boy, and we added rhubarb and blueberry and cherry, 2 different barrels, and also 2 different strains of Brettanomyces after the beer's already been fermented with the Omega Saison yeast.
And so, can you talk to the folks at Omega? What is that relationship like? Because I know they've got a ton of different yeast that you can be pulling from.
It's really cool because they're so genuinely interested in experimentation and developing new yeast strains and working with brewers. It's great for me to get advice on, what temperature I want to have a fermentation conducted at, or how many cells of a yeast culture I want to pitch into a new beer that I haven't made before. And so getting that advice is incredible, and at the same time, they've taken interest in the result.
You've got your grains, your malts, your hops, and your yeast. And for the past 10 years, people have really gone crazy in the hops world. They're bringing hops over from Australia. The malt world, they're finding heirloom malts and all that sort of thing. But what hasn't been really pushed as hard, we think, is the yeast side. So we're finding strains from all over the world and having these relationships not only with our customers, but finding other people who are as passionate out there about yeast and finding these strains and keep expanding the boundaries and pushing the boundaries.
It used to be that people would add things like fruit or other flavorings to the beer. Now they're really starting to understand the role that yeast can play in developing those unique flavors and those unique styles.
Right, yeah, yeast can obviously play a huge role. A Hefeweizen yeast from Germany is going to produce huge amounts of banana and clove flavors. That's not what you're going to want if you're making an American Pilsner. So, yeast choice is essential, and they can either bring a huge amount of flavor to it or kind of stay in the background and let you focus on the malt and the hops.
That, I think, is what's really interesting for a lot of folks who don't really think about the flavor components of yeast. They're just thinking that yeast makes alcohol, but it makes a lot more than that.
Right.
It's fun nowadays because we're taking these old yeast strains and we're kind of rediscovering what people have been using for eons, and that tells a story of a time and a place. It's very cool.
It's a lot of fun to get out and get to talk to the brewer and get to know them personally. We look over our strain lists, we get to go see their system, try their beers. It's a really great, intimate kind of relationship to get to know them. And there's nothing more flattering than to get to try a beer that somebody is so proud of because you helped them make that with yeast.
For more information on Omega Yeast, as well as all of the fabulous breweries we've featured in this episode, just head to wearetastemakers.com. Thanks for joining me here in Chicago, and I will see you next time.